From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peggy Pearlstein, head of the Hebraic section here in the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. Welcome to today's program, a talk by Irvin Ungar on Arthur Szyk and his Passover Haggadah, a Library of Congress treasure, co-sponsored by the Rare Book and Special Collections Division and the Prints and Photographs Division. A noted authority on the Szyk legacy, Irvin Ungar received rabbinic ordination from the Academy for Jewish Religion, a master's degree in education from New York University, and a master's degree in sacred theology from New York Theological Seminary. A former pulpit rabbi, he founded Historicana, an antiquarian bookstore in Burlingame, California, that specializes in Szyk's work in 1987. He's also the curator of the Arthur Szyk Society and a frequent lecturer on Szyk and his work. At the conclusion of the program, you're invited to our conference room in the back here to see the 1940 first edition of the Szyk Haggadah and the 1957 edition from the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, the 2008 deluxe facsimile edition and commentary held by the Hebraic section, which is a gift of Madison Council members L. Dennis and Susan R. Shapiro, and the Declaration of Independence illuminated by Szyk and held by the Prints and Photographs Division. It will be a real feast when this talk is over. Both hard copy and paperback editions of this newest facsimile edition of the Szyk Haggadah will be available for sale after the talk in the back of the room. I want to call your attention to a program that will be here next Wednesday, April 13th at noon. Dr. Edward Goldberg, former director of the Medici Archive Project, will speak about his new book, Jews and Magic in Medici, Florence, and you can pick up flyers in the front at the information desk. This event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period, but please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transition of your remarks. And now, Irvin Ungar.
Thank you, Peggy. It's indeed an honor to be here at the Library of Congress. Let me say at the outset, Peggy, in your initial comments, you actually indicated that after I speak, it'll be a feast. To see, I hope it'll be a feast also in the first part of the program as well. There's a story of and I'm not quite sure how many of you have heard of Arthur Szyk before you came to this presentation, but I'm reminded of a story about a little girl who, about 6 years old, was in a classroom, and she was once drawing, and the teacher went over to her and asked her, what are you drawing there? And she says, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher said, you know, no one knows what God looks like. And the little girl said to the teacher, well, when I finish this drawing, everybody is going to know what God looks like. Well, everyone here may not know who Arthur Szyk is, but hopefully by the time I finish this presentation, everybody here will have a good picture of exactly what Szyk looks like. First, let me give you a very, very, very brief chronology of his life so we can put his Passover Haggadah into context. Arthur Szyk was born in Łódź, Poland, in Łódź, a little west of Warsaw in 1894. And for many of you who know the artist Norman Rockwell, he was born in the same year, 1894, as an illustrator, and many people, of course, know Arthur Szyk as an illustrator. he was born there, and when he was a 6-year-old, it was said that he was already creating drawings of the Boxer Rebellion in China. Picture this, a Jewish boy in the middle of Poland doing sketches of the Boxer Rebellion. As a teenager, his parents sent him off as a 15-year-old to Paris, where he studied in the Academy Julienne. He was there about 2 years, the same year as the artist Diego Rivera, for those of you who are familiar with his art. Actually, though, Szyk was not really in class for that two-year period, full 2-year period. Records recently indicated that he went to about 12 classes as a teenager within 2 years. So all the talent that he amassed was not really in the classroom or under great and well-known teachers. He went back to Poland and in 1914 visited Palestine for his first and only visit, was there for about 6 months. World War I broke out. He was conscripted into the Russian army. He fled. That's how he survived. After the war, Poland was at war with the Bolsheviks. Arthur Szyk became the director of art propaganda for Poland in its war against the Bolsheviks. That war ended, and Arthur Szyk settled in Paris. He had numerous one-man art exhibitions there. I suspect there wasn't anyone who was well known at the time whom Szyk did not know, or who did not know Szyk. He illustrated many books in Paris in the 20s. 1930s, he continued to live in Paris and in Poland. In 1937, he moved to London, was there for 3 years. In 1940, came to America, where he actually went on to become the leading anti-Nazi artist in America during World War II. More about that later. The war ends in 1945. He turns his attention to 3 matters. He returns back to that of book illustration, and there he illustrates books such as Andersen's Fairy Tales, Arabian Nights Entertainments, Canterbury Tales, biblical books of Job and Ruth, and others. He turns his attention to 2 other matters, and that is he begins to create his greatest Americana. One of those works is the Declaration of Independence of the United States, which is, for those who remain after my presentation, you're going to have a rare opportunity to see the original art, which is in the room behind me. He also illustrated the Bill of Rights and For Freedom's Prayer, among other works. And the third matter is he turned his attention to the creation of the State of Israel and produced probably more art than any other Jewish artist to help bring about the Jewish state. In the late 1940s, Arthur Szyk was investigated by the House on Un-American Activities after he had devoted his whole life to freedom and the creation of works on behalf of humanity. He died of a heart attack at age 57 in 1951. That is an overview and chronology. I know that so much of this needs amplification and going into, so you'll have to come back another time when hopefully maybe I'll be invited back to the Library of Congress someday to deliver an overview of Arthur Szyk's art. But even if I'm not, I'm so singularly privileged to be here today. So now, in 1930, before I even begin to delve into the Haggadah, a word about the Passover Haggadah. The Hebrew word Haggadah means the telling. It is the book that Jews use at the holiday of Passover, always in the springtime and comes in a few weeks, when Jews sit down to tell the story of the ancient Israelites and their enslavement in Egypt and their exodus led by Moses out of ancient Egypt. That is the narrative that Jews tell every year, again and again and again. And the book that is used is the Passover Haggadah, the book of the telling of that narrative. It's been illustrated and written about and published in more than 5,000 different editions over the centuries. In 1933, in the very year that Hitler came to power, a Jew from Poland was invited to come to the United States. Arthur Szyk was invited to come for an exhibition of his art dealing with freedom that was going to be held here at the Library of Congress. And in 1933 of December, he and his wife arrived. They were photographed, they were documented, they came here for an exhibition of his art. This is after Arthur Szyk had already completed numerous works dealing with freedom. One of those works, the Statute of Kalisz, was worked on by him in Paris in the late 20s, was published in Vienna in 1932 as a portfolio. Statutes were the laws of the Polish town of Kalisz that in the 13th century under Boleslav the Pious, Jews were granted civil and religious privileges by Poland. Szyk completed this work, and he traveled to 13 Polish cities with the original art in the early 1930s with the hope that Poland at that time and the other nations in Europe would grant the same civil and religious privileges to the minorities and the Jews, particularly of Europe at that time, hoping to realize that countries could benefit if they empowered their minorities. Szyk completed these works, and then they were published. Also, in the late 1920s and around 1930, Arthur Szyk completed another series of works entitled George Washington and the American Revolution. These 38 paintings, featuring all the major battle scenes, Lexington, Concord, Valley Forge, portraits of Franklin and Kosciuszko and Pulaski and those who contributed to the well-being and the independence of America, he completed this whole series of works even before he had come to America. These works were purchased by the President of Poland and given to Franklin Roosevelt as a gift, and all 38 paintings actually hung in the Roosevelt White House until 1941. At the time that, in January of 1941, when Roosevelt gave his 4 freedom speech, freedom from fear, freedom from want, 38 paintings of Arthur Szyk hung in the White House. In 1934, late 33 and 34, Arthur Szyk arrives in America. Here's a newspaper clipping showing him and his wife, Julia. Let me back up for a second. Szyk was invited here not only for the exhibition of his works at the Library of Congress dealing with freedom, but also because the United States government wanted to present him with the George Washington Bicentennial Medal. And he was presented with that award. It was the third of 3 medals. It was the third country to actually decorate him. Poland had given him the Gold Cross of Merit for his works dealing with freedom, and the French government sent Arthur Szyk to Morocco to paint a portrait of the Pasha of Marrakesh to create closer relations between France and Morocco, and when he returned to France, they presented him with the Palme Académique. So Szyk comes to America now and is being recognized in 1934 by the third government to acknowledge his talents and his art in the service of humanity. In 1934, late 1934, Arthur Szyk returns to Łódź, Poland, to his place of birth, where his mother and brother are still living. He returns there with his wife. His daughter and son had been left behind, being taken care of by the nanny, so they were still in Poland. But Szyk and his wife return from America back to Poland, and it is then that he sets out to illustrate his Passover Haggadah. Now, this Haggadah is going to be different than any other that has ever been illustrated or which has a commentary. And that is because with Hitler in power now for over a year and a half, Szyk begins to see Hitler as the new Pharaoh and the Nazis as the new Egyptians who had come to annihilate the Jewish people. So in his Haggadah, he's going to paint swastikas on all of the Egyptians and on the backs of snakes. But no one in Europe, when Szyk finishes all 48 paintings, this size, watercolor and gouache paintings, when he finishes all of them, no one will publish the books. No one in Austria, even though he had a great work on freedom printed there in Vienna in 1932. Nobody in Germany is going to publish it, even though his Statutes of Kalisz dealing with freedom were published in Munich in 1932. No one in Czechoslovakia is going to touch it. And so in 1937, he goes off to England, where a company is founded to publish that Haggadah. But still then, he has to paint over the swastikas, for no one is comfortable with them. How do we know that there were swastikas there if they were painted over, and when the book was first published, we don't see the swastikas? It turns out that a number of years ago, I was actually in Tel Aviv. I visited an elderly man who told me that when he was a young child of 7 or 8 years old, living in the Polish town of Lvov, over here, which is about 200 miles or so from Łódź, where Szyk was born, Szyk traveled to Lvov to meet Mr. Horowitz, who is the chairman of a co-op of helping to support Arthur Szyk in the reproduction of his works. And Arthur Szyk brought with him all 48 paintings to Mr. Horowitz's house. This young boy came down the steps, saw on the dining room table all the original paintings of the Haggadah and saw the swastikas there. Fast forward numerous decades, I meet him in Tel Aviv. He tells me this narrative, and when in 2002 there was an exhibition of Arthur Szyk's art at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum called The Art and Politics of Arthur Szyk, they looked at these images under special lighting, and under the layers of paint, the swastikas were found. You see on the chest of the Egyptian here, as small as it is, under that layer of paint were the swastikas. And here, another image from Szyk's Haggadah, for one of the emphasis of his Haggadah is, of course, drawing that comparison to the ancient Egyptians, is here you see the image of Judith, very beautiful. Actually, it's said that this is a portrait of Szyk's wife. It was said she was very beautiful. Here is Judith, who has the decapitated head of Holofernes here, whom she's cut off with Holofernes' own sword, which is right here. And at the very end of the sword, right here, which ends on the, which sort of overlaps the tail of the lion, there was once a swastika, but again painted over. But in a pamphlet that I found in 1944, Szyk had actually painted the swastika back on when it was here in the United States. So you can see these elements appeared throughout the Haggadah. And also, with regard to the 4 sons, the Haggadah has 4 sons, the wise son, the wicked son, the one who doesn't know how to ask a question, and the very simple son. All of them here, it's to the wicked son I want to draw your attention, representing really 4 different types of people. Here, in most illustrated Passover Haggadot, the wicked son is often seen as a warrior, because the warriors were the wicked ones who wanted to kill, to annihilate the Jews throughout the centuries. Szyk does not paint that warrior here as the wicked son. Rather, he paints a very Germanesque figure here with riding boots, a crop, a feathered hat, and a very Hitler-like mustache on him. This is painted by him in Poland in 1934. Again, Hitler's been in power now for a little over a year and a half. It is said that when this was first painted, actually Szyk had painted a swastika as an armband on the wicked son, but this whole quadrant here had been cut out, and this is what you see here is the new painting here. Again, this was placed there in the late 1930s, but initially there was an armband here of a swastika on him. You know, I don't believe Szyk would have painted this in the late 1930s with a Jew wearing a swastika, but why would he have done it in 1934? And it's said that there were some Jews in Germany at the time who identified early, very early, with the National Socialist Party and the Nazi Party in terms of the economic reforms that they were promising. Szyk would have seen them as the wicked sons and painted them here. Another component of his Haggadah, which makes it different than any others, and considering the time in which he painted these images, was that of heroism. That was really important to Szyk, not the idea of Jews as victims. And so toward the end of my explication of this, we'll dwell on that. This is all within the context of the prayer, which is referred to as Ha lachma anya. This is the bread of affliction. By the way, the bread of affliction is that flat cracker bread, the matzah which Jews eat. That's the bread of affliction. It didn't have time to rise when they left Egypt. Conversely, it's also known as the bread of liberation as well. So it has both, means both things. This is the first Hebrew letter here, very like an illuminated manuscript, has an initialized letter, this letter Hey, that comes down like this and also goes like this. And within that letter here, Szyk has painted Abraham entertaining the 3 strangers. There's a legend that says that when these angels dressed up as strangers came to visit Abraham and he offered them hospitality in the book of Genesis, They actually came on the eve of Passover, so Abraham was serving them, of course, this matzah, this bread of affliction. That's what Jews would have eaten. But this takes place hundreds of years before the Exodus narrative, but that's a legend that's associated with Abraham's kindness. At the same time, Szyk has painted here an Israelite warrior, constantly seen throughout the Haggadah, the Israelite warrior who's striking here the leopard. But down, look below, you see these men here who are in chains here. These are the workers for the Egyptians who've been enslaved in Egypt. But on the other side here, Szyk has painted workers here, not wearing any chains, but carrying a shovel, going off to the land of Israel to be chalutzin, pioneers in the land. And in the bottom right here, on his arm, actually, Szyk has actually painted a tattoo, quite forbidden in Jewish tradition, but the idea is that this is a tattoo not in response to the tattoos which were put in inmates in concentration camps, because that hadn't taken place yet. But this tattoo is actually a Star of David, because Szyk is giving this very macho quality to Jews who he wants to be strong and vigorous, who will go off to the land of Israel to settle it. So you begin to see in his Haggadah also the Zionist motifs that he's planted there. Again, that's very important if you're in Poland and it's 1935 as Szyk sees it, and 1935 being the very year of Germany's passage of the Nuremberg laws, which had restricted Jews in all areas of life. Another element of heroism is that many of you may know that Moses' name does not appear in the Passover Haggadah. What do you say? He's the one who led the Israelites out of Egypt. If you watch Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments or you've read your narratives, you know that Moses was involved. But for the rabbis who compiled and edited the traditional Passover text, it was God who redeemed the Israelites, God who took them out, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, of bondage. That the rabbis had not wanted an emphasis on human beings in redemption. But for Arthur Szyk, who was an activist artist, he believed that people had to be involved in the affairs of man, that it needed people to stand up to injustice and tyranny. So Szyk places Moses back within the Haggadah, but when he places him back, it's really not as a religious figure. It's more as a military figure. After all, look at this 80-year-old man here. He has the body, he looks like a bodybuilder in a way, very muscular. And you see his arms are raised. They're being held up by Aaron, his brother, and by Hur, the warrior. It is said, the narrative, the biblical narrative in Exodus says that every time Moses' arms were raised, the Israelites were victorious in battle. But when his arms fell to the side, they would lose. And so Szyk knows this narrative, and he hopes that again, Jews will be heroic in this time, and uses Moses as that kind of figure to look toward. Or the idea, when you think of the Exodus narrative, who is it who's in the chariots chasing the Israelites? Well, it's the Egyptians. But for Arthur Szyk in his Passover Haggadah, in the chariot happened to be two Jews. Here is the Star of David. Here is the blue and white banner, which later became part of the flag of the State of Israel, but again, being painted by Szyk in 1935 with the dove of peace over King David in the chariot, while the fallen enemy of Israel is below the horses here, while the eagle of either Rome or of Nazi Germany hovers over the enemy of Israel, as Szyk has painted this in 1935. He supervises the printing of the Haggadah in London from 1937 to 1940. It's published by the Beaconsfield Press, a group of Jews from Lvov who helped finance the printing of this Haggadah. 250 copies only are printed. It's not printed on paper. It's actually printed on vellum, on parchment. For those of you who've been into a synagogue and they open the ark and they take out the scroll that's read, the Sefer Torah or the Torah scroll that has the 5 books of Moses in it, that is actually handwritten on parchment, on the skin of an animal. These parchment scroll pages or leaves were brought into London, and Szyk supervised its printing in color on vellum in 1940. One of those copies, 250 copies, is here at the Library of Congress, and you will have an opportunity to see it later. It was a breakthrough in printing in color on parchment in 1940. And the Times of London said about this that it was a book that was worthy of being considered among the most beautiful of books ever produced by the hand of man. And in 1940, it was the most expensive new book in the entire world. Each copy of that book sold for $500 in 1940. I suspect that there are many of you who've seen the King's Speech. Can you raise your hand, please, if you did? Okay. Or the Academy Awards, in which it became the Best Picture. In 1936, Arthur Szyk dedicated, through his art, he worked on the original paintings from 1934 to 1936 in Poland. George became king in December of 1936. Szyk finished his Haggadah and dedicated his Haggadah to George VI. It may be difficult for you, this is the dedication page, and it may be a little difficult for you to see, but there is a G there, a Roman numeral 6 underneath it. Szyk has signed his name here on the bottom, Łódź, where he completed the art, which was his home of his birth. In 1936, it's dated here in the bottom right-hand corner. Why did Szyk dedicate the Haggadah to King George? 2 reasons. A, he was going off to London. Makes sense, dedicated to the King of England if you're going off to London to have your book published. Second of all, in 1936, Arthur Szyk saw England at the forefront of fighting Nazism. After all, remember, America's not in the war for 5 more years. So Szyk dedicates his Haggadah because England is going to be at the forefront, hopefully, of rescuing his people and of standing up to the Nazis. And so he dedicates this page in English, again, an illuminated manuscript meant for reproduction, quite unlike the illuminated manuscripts of the past, which were meant to be kept within the family or passed on within their family. Szyk created an illuminated manuscript for the purpose of reproduction. So he hoped that everyone would see this dedication, which, in his words, says, "At the feet of your most gracious majesty, I humbly lay these works of my hands, shewing," the British word for showing, "forth the afflictions of my people, Israel." And he completes this in 1936. But there's a problem with this dedication page. What is the problem? The problem is that in 1936, the British had begun to pass what were called a series of white papers. What were the white papers? These were rules and laws that restricted the flow and immigration and the exodus of the Jews out of Europe. The most famous white paper is the 1939 MacDonald white paper, but they were passed as early as 1936. Now, if you were Arthur Szyk, how would you emotionally and intellectually handle this if you were illustrating the great book of freedom? And the Nazis are coming like this, and the British are stopping the flow and the movement of Jews out of Europe in the face of growing anti-Semitism and the Nazi threat. Here's how Szyk handled it. In the bottom right-hand corner, he paints the portrait of European Jews. Remember, this is a book about the exodus of the ancient Israelites out of Egypt. He paints European Jews here, who want to leave Europe. And in the bottom left-hand corner here, he paints British castle gates, and on it there's a Hebrew word, which is Zion, Zion, the land of Israel. He's painting European Jews who wish to leave Europe to get to the land of Israel, and between them he actually paints a British military ship that stands between the exodus of the Jews out of Europe and going to the land of Israel. For Arthur Szyk, this religious book is actually more a political book. It's a book about tyranny, it's a book about oppression, it's a book about justice and about freedom. And so this was the emphasis of Arthur Szyk when he created these paintings, taking all of them to England, supervising its printing through 3 years, and many of these books were being published in 1940 when the Battle of Britain was taking place, and they're printing this book, but with the hope that the world ultimately would get an opportunity to understand Jewish history and tyranny versus freedom. This first copy of this book was actually presented to George VI. I actually have in my possession a copy of the letter written by the librarian for the king to the Beaconsfield Press and to Arthur Szyk, in which the king acknowledges that he's indeed honored, greatly honored, and to receive this great book, so magnificently made and so important. And the king demonstrates that, as the librarian says, by him keeping it personally in his possession for over a fortnight, for over 2 weeks, where everyone who came to see him in Buckingham Palace would have the opportunity to see Arthur Szyk's great masterwork. Afterwards, the king places that in Windsor Castle for safekeeping, and the war continues. At the same time that Arthur Szyk was working on the publishing of this Haggadah, he was also creating vigorously anti-Nazi art. And in fact, as early as the early 1930s, he had done an image of Hitler looking like Pharaoh, with Goering by his side, and dressed as an Egyptian as well. And another example of Szyk's art in the 1930s that was published is just an image of Hitler standing on top of the Reichstag, and on one hand he's holding up a swastika, on the other hand he's holding up an olive branch. And Szyk paints him with sheep's clothing that goes over his head. And you know the expression, don't trust a wolf in sheep's clothing. Szyk also used to say, never trust a wolf that promises to be a vegetarian. And his art was continuously published, and in fact, in 1940, the Polish, he's there 1939 in September, the Germans invade Poland, and later in September, the Russians invade Poland. World War II breaks out, and the Polish government relocates to London. It is that government, the Polish government in exile, and the British, who then send Arthur Szyk to America to help bring the face of the war in Europe. This being the 4 questions of the Haggadah. But here's what I want to come to. It is works like this that would be published in America in 1941, Arthur Szyk's work, The New Order, attacking the Nazis' New Order through caricature, cartoon, and satire, blistering and powerful. This was published in America, the first book of its kind, 5 months before the United States entered the war. His art appeared everywhere, and magazines and newspapers would carry articles that here was a one-man war against Hitler. Arthur Szyk fights the dictators with pen, with brush, and with venom. His art was everywhere. If you were a soldier who went through a USO base, you would see his art exhibit over 500 USO bases. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it was Arthur Szyk's art that was on the front cover of Time magazine showing Admiral Yamamoto as the aggressor. His art was everywhere. In 1945, the war's over, and Szyk continues to create his work. In 1951, Szyk dies, as I mentioned earlier in my introduction. In 1956, his Passover Haggadah is republished in Israel. 10,000 copies are reproduced on paper, sometimes with a blue velvet cover, and you'll see one of those copies also in the room behind me after the presentation. 1956, 57, and the 60s, 80s, 90s, right on up to 2000. I've always been interested in I've not always been interested in Arthur Szyk, but if you ask Peggy Pearlstein, she would tell you that I've thought about Arthur Szyk from when I was in utero, right, Peggy? No. In any case, I was invited to Jerusalem in 1994 to give a talk about Arthur Szyk at Hebrew University. And in the middle of the talk, I actually said that Szyk was born on June 3rd, 1894. And I realized that the first public talk that I was ever giving about Arthur Szyk was actually now June 3rd, 1994. It was 100 years to the very day that I gave my first presentation about Szyk. Now, I'm not really a great mystical guy, but I'm sort of mystical in a way, but I want you to follow me on this journey just a little bit. After I gave the talk, someone came up to me and suggested that maybe I should consider maybe publishing a new edition of the Szyk Haggadah. And I said, why? And he said, well, you know, no one's ever really seen how brilliant the colors are of the original art. Maybe you ought to consider that. Well, I sort of filed that idea away, and then I began to think about that. And in 1997, I actually curated my first museum exhibit of Arthur Szyk's art in Chicago. And it turned out the person who owned the original art, all 48 paintings of the Szyk Haggadah, was in Chicago. So I got to examine all of them in preparation for that exhibition and other works of art. And it turns out that then in the year 2000, an exhibition of Arthur Szyk's art was held here at the Library of Congress. It was the first exhibition of the new millennium, and it was called Arthur Szyk, Artist for Freedom. And it was at that time someone anonymously donated to the Library of Congress Arthur Szyk's original of the Declaration of Independence of the United States, which he completed in 1950 while living in New Canaan, Connecticut, and which was first unveiled to the public on July 4th, 1950. And so that was part of the exhibition here, and I continued to curate other museum exhibits following that. Well, back in 2005, I got up the nerve to go and see the person in Chicago who owns all of the original Szyk paintings. And by profession, I'm an antiquarian bookseller. I went to him, and being a great lover now of Arthur Szyk, I asked him what his plans were with the original paintings. And he said that he wasn't quite sure. And I said to him, well, Dick, if you ever decide you want to sell them, I'd like to represent you in this sale. Now, it turns out that being a lawyer, he asked me, well, A, what do you think you can get for it, and why do you think you can sell it? Well, I convinced him that I thought I can get a lot of money for it, and I convinced him that I could sell it, and we signed a contract. I had never signed such a long contract in representing someone as a bookseller, but I was happy to do it in this case. Szyk certainly deserved that. I then, after I signed this agreement, I actually had several people come and, before that, I went actually back to my reference library, and I looked up where Dick had obtained these. He had told me he bought them in an auction at Sotheby's in 1982. So I went back to that auction catalog, and I looked up and I read about each one of the paintings that had sold. And then I turned to the cover of the auction catalog. And do you know what the date was on the cover of that auction catalog? It was June 3rd. It was Arthur Szyk's birthday, on which the Haggadah originals were sold. I don't think the family knew, or the consigners, or the person who purchased it. Okay, you're sitting there saying, okay, is this guy, what is he making of this June 3rd business? But in any case, to me, that was significant. I represented Dick for 6 months, showed the Haggadah to some prospective buyers, and then realized neither of them were buying it, and the contract ran out. And I went back to the contract, and I looked at it, and I said, oh my gosh. The date that we had signed the contract here was June 3rd. He gave me another month, and private clients of mine actually flew out to Chicago, and they actually purchased all of the original paintings of the Haggadah. When they came back to their home and in Northern California, I asked them if they had shown it to their children yet, because they have 3 children who know that they collect Szyk, and they know that they love Jewish objects, and they're very close family. And I asked them if they had shown it to them yet, and they said no. I called a few weeks later. Paul and Sherry said no, we didn't get it together yet. We just haven't. I said, then I finally called, and they said yes, we showed it this past Saturday. I said, that's when your family got together and everybody looked at it for the first time? I said, do you know what date that is? It was June 3rd. So at that point, with all of the works of art there being in California, I decided to embark on this thought that had come to me in 1994 about someday reproducing an entirely new edition, because I had access to all the original paintings close by. And I brought a photographer from Jerusalem who came to my dining room. He had just finished photographing the Dead Sea Scrolls for the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, and a Codex Vaticanus for the Vatican. And I thought that to myself, You know, if he's good enough for the Israel Museum and the Vatican, then certainly he could come photograph the Szyk Haggadah, and he did. He came to my dining room. I hired a filmmaker, and we captured all this on film, and I hired a designer from eventually from North Carolina, and a printer from Philadelphia. After all, if I'm going to reprint the Passover Haggadah, a book about freedom, why not do it at some place right across the street from the Liberty Bell? And I did, and I found a bookbinder who actually binds books for various presidents in the White House, and for Robin Williams and Oprah Winfrey and others. And I assembled this team and decided to publish a new edition of the Szyk Haggadah with a different commentary and translation from that of 1940, and to print this book as the first book in the world actually to be printed on this scale, that is 300 copies, as a limited edition, entirely by inkjet printing. And so this is printed by digital printing, and a copy of that, a premiere edition of that book, you'll see in the room behind me. And so this was published in 2008 and produced a companion volume with it called Freedom Illuminated, Understanding the Szyk Haggadah. But that still wasn't enough. It seemed that everyone had to have access to this book, and so just a few weeks ago, Abrams Books in New York actually published this as a popular trade edition. Transliteration has been added for those who may not read Hebrew sitting at the Passover table at the Seder meal. Instructions have been expanded in the commentary section in the back, and following this presentation, I understand that there will be copies available that people can purchase if they'd like from the Library of Congress. But this is the narrative, this is the tale. This is the story behind the story of the story. It has so many layers, just like Szyk's art has so many layers. And I hope that this has given you some brief introduction and some overview that you can take away with you, just like that teacher did when the teacher looked at this piece of paper and learned what the girl was drawing. The very last image in Szyk's Passover Haggadah is another dedication page. This one is in French, more an international language at the time. Just like you have the King George dedication page in English, you have this at the end. And here in French, Szyk writes, "I am but a Jew praying in art. If I've succeeded in any measure, if I've gained the power of reception among the elite of the world, I owe it all to the teachings, to the traditions, and to the eternal virtues of my people." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have time for a couple of questions before we invite you into the back. Yes. And can you please talk loudly? Are there records of the original purchases of the 1940 edition?
Yes. Yes, there are some records. The chairman of the Beaconsfield Press actually had prepared the list of some of the initial purchasers of it, and so there's a partial list. And 125 copies were numbered for distribution in the United Kingdom, and 125 were sent to America for distribution here. But we do have a partial list, but not a complete list, and it's very partial.
Audrey.
Yeah, the question is, what was on exhibition when the exhibition of Arthur Szyk was held here at the Library of Congress? Actually, in 1934, he came here in December of '33. The exhibit was in 1934. It was not only Washington and his times. It also included other illustrated works. At the time, I don't have a complete checklist, but it was not the only work that was being exhibited here. But it'd be great if you could find in some records here so we could all know what exactly was exhibited here. I'd love to know.
One last question. Yes. No, right here. Well, then he'll be able to speak to them. All right, one last question.
When Szyk was here in 33, 34, Columbia Pictures contacted Szyk, and he actually illustrated the front cover for their 1934 and 1935 yearbook for Columbia Pictures. Also, at the end of his life, he was in contact with many people who were in Hollywood or in the theater in New York who came to visit him both in New York and in New Canaan, Connecticut, where he moved in 1945. So he was constantly surrounded by people who were active and who were being looked at by the McCarthyites at the time, and though Szyk was, and as it turned out, he was actually, I hate to end on this note as the last question, but maybe I'll reverse it a little bit. You know, even though in 1949 UAC published a publication in which Szyk was named to be a member of 7 subversive organizations, this, by the way, after Eleanor Roosevelt regularly wrote about him in her columns, after his works were at the White House, after at Mitchell Field they called him citizen soldier of the free world. This is after this great patriot who came to America. They named him to be a member of 7 subversive organizations with Albert Einstein and others. This is when he created his greatest Americana, as I mentioned earlier, the Bill of Rights, and that Declaration of Independence that he illuminated. The boys in New Canaan, Connecticut, when it was unveiled, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts had lined the streets. The marching band was there. Szyk was on the dais. They unveiled the Declaration of Independence and hailed him really as a great citizen soldier and American patriot of the free world. This was Arthur Szyk, who loved 3 countries during his lifetime. Poland, the land of his birth, although he didn't like the anti-Semitism that he saw and experienced. Israel, which he saw as the land of his people, and America, which he saw as the land of his ideals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. As I said, books are available for sale, hardback and softback.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.